Happy Friday, everyone. Alyssa Knight here. Joining me in another episode of Aite Radio is going to be Jay Thorne from Broadcom, where we're going to be discussing API security. Jay is the product leader, architect, and development leader over at Broadcom, over their API security and management products that was acquired through their acquisition of CA, who acquired Layer 7. Jay's going to be discussing the idiosyncratic distinctions between API management solutions and API security solutions, as well as what CISOs can do to protect themselves against this new threat in the API economy. So sit back, relax, grab that cup of joe, and join us for another episode of Aite Radio coming up.
I started 1.5 million years ago when the Earth was still cooling.
You look a lot younger than that.
Thank you. Thank you. I remember the Cretaceous period as being particularly egregious. Truthfully, what happened is I came from the hardware world through database administration into software development and then software development management. I went through a couple of years in the trenches of the dot-coms. And then, around about 2000 or so, everything went to hell, 2001, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And got a job with the first funded startup in Vancouver called Layer 7. And I was one of the first, I was a working manager. So I built our first appliance, did the network security for it, and segued into a role of management. And from then on,
True startup environment, you wore every hat.
I did wear every hat. So moving on to what else happened, the working with individual customers and working with their requirements was what led us into the mobile space. And around about 2010 or so, we decided that taking a standard message in a mobile device and getting the right kind of things added to the message that made it appropriate to send across the internet, like mutual auth SSL and credentials bound into the message, and orchestrating an OAuth was hard. So we wrote a library that did that, and then we ended up making a product out of it called the Mobile API Gateway. And we continue to sell that piece as one of our #1 selling features. Is we had mobile long before anyone else did. And we have a mobile helper library. The helper library is turning out to be a really amazing tool because of the risk management that it can do. So because it can look at the user credentials and the device credentials and the app credentials all at the same time, you can start to do things that just aren't possible in other ways. So that brings us up to the present. There's been a long evolution. About a year ago, we got an announcement that Broadcom was taking us over. And in that time, they asked my group around leadership what they were going to do. And they kind of wanted to evolve to a more technical leader. And I was asked to come from the chief architect role into leading the entire product management team. So I run the product management business for API management for Broadcom now.
Okay, so I thought CA acquired Layer 7
and
Broadcom acquired CA.
So let's
came first.
let's fit that into context. So around 2013, our little .com or startup, which had been running for 10 years, was acquired by CA. We were brought in to the security and integration group at the time, and there was a bit of weird stuff where we were part of the group and then not part of the group, but that ran for 5 years until late 2018 when Broadcom acquired CA. Now, the transaction buying Layer 7 was quite small by today's standards. It was only 150 million. But
that's not bad.
It wasn't bad. We were a 10-year-old company.
You were how old?
10-year-old at that time.
Oh, okay.
And then the Broadcom acquisition was a rather large one. That was 19 billion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of the largest acquisitions in the space in a long time.
Well, CA also had a lot of products, a lot of assets. I mean, there was a lot there.
at one point, there was a count of the number of SKUs, and it was something like 5,000 different stock keeping units.
Yeah, that's crazy. CA was definitely one of those 10 billion pound gorillas that they just were in everything. They did
Well,
everything.
I'd argue that the space in some ways was dominated by a lot of software vendors. There was Oracle, there was IBM as a software vendor, and there was CA as a software vendor, and IBM as a software vendor. All of those other firms have hardware businesses,
Right, right.
right?
Yeah, and CA was pure software, right?
CA was pure software.
There were no hardware pizza boxes at CA.
Well, that's the funny thing is there actually are, and there were.
Oh, really?
There was two of them, one from the Privileged Access Management group and one from Layer 7, because we always had the hardware appliance, very important,
Oh, okay.
the federal space especially. So that's an important point to note is that we did have a hardware business. Obviously, we didn't make the hardware from scratch. Now,
Right.
on Broadcom, we don't make whole machines, but we make a lot of the chips that are in the machines that we actually vend through. So Broadcom doesn't make hardware in the sense of whole systems, but it does make an awful lot of chips. So that's one of the things is we own a business related to storage in the enterprise. We own a lot of chip businesses, so cellular.
Yeah, I remember. I have a picture of a chip in my head with the Broadcom logo on it. It's like.
Yep, absolutely right. That's the overall stream of things. Now, I'm part of what's called the Security and Integration Group, and that encompasses basically most of our security products within the company, so privileged access management, the single sign-on product, SiteMinder, the identity and access management product called, we call it IDAM internally, and then the Layer 7, the former Layer 7 product line, which we called API management. Now, thanks to working for that group, we've rebranded to the old name. So we're Layer 7 again.
Oh, you're kidding. So Broadcom, oh, that's interesting. What was the decision around that?
Well, it's one of the most recognizable brands. We have several brands that we owned from the acquisition, things like that. The Layer 7 brand was the most closely associated with security and integration, but wasn't a product name. SiteMinder was also a very strong brand, but it was associated with a single product.
Right, okay.
So Layer 7 was a brand associated with the overall the space, and it's still a well-respected name. So we're going by Layer 7 again.
Okay, so you are not, when you're introducing yourself to a potential client, you don't introduce yourself as Broadcom, you introduce yourself as Layer 7.
Layer 7,
like a Broadcom company.
Yes.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. All right. So let's educate our viewers, our listeners for a bit on APIs. So you guys are an API. You guys have your flagship product is an API security product, right?
The flagship
with management capabilities.
The biggest part of the product line is API management. And so that's encompassed in two product lines, the API Management UI, formerly known as the API Management Portal, and the API Gateway.
Okay.
So the Gateway is the longest standing product. It's the one with the 17-year history. It's the one that we started coding back in 2003. The API Management UI, the portal, is a control plane tool meant to help customers onboard developers to use the APIs.
Okay, right? So you guys would sit in front of the API servers, proxying all the traffic, inspecting it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's actually built technically as a reverse proxy. Good point there. And yes, it sits in front of the APIs, inspects all the traffic, and only conditionally forwards it on because of that policy language and how it inspects things before it goes through. So in many ways, it's like a deep packet inspection type firewall, but because we know the message structures as part of the publication of an API, we can look beyond whether the packets are coming from a bad place. We can look at whether the API itself is structured in a bad way. We can look at relationships in the message. We could do things back in the bad old days of XML-based APIs, over things like coercive XML parsing, and the famous XML bomb and things like that, that we could prevent ever touching a back-end system. We would stop it very early. Then there's the whole idea of looking for credentials, and that's important. But when you looking at credentials, there's also furnishing credentials and redirecting to the right place to obtain the credentials, because it might be different for this API versus that API. Maybe this API, we allow a social login and off you go to Facebook to get a credential. But on this one, you have to have an internal credential and only that, for instance. So that's part of what the job is orchestrating that credentialing, orchestrating that the requests are formed correctly, they conform to the API. It's just like in a firewall, you do close by default in an API gateway. You close everything and then you open up the few things that you want. So our publication works that you publish a single API and a single URL, and that's the only thing that will respond to a probe, for instance. Everything else will just return a 404.
Sort of the opposite concept of a web application firewall, open everything up and by default, and then close down what. So so what you're saying is that instead of filtering based on traffic directionality, ports and protocols, you guys do a heck of a lot more. You guys have context awareness. You guys are looking at, what I'm assuming according to the Swagger or the Open API, what the contract allows, what it doesn't allow according to the specific API behind you. You guys are looking at that traffic and making sure, like you said, it conforms to what the API supports and what is allowed. So it's a lot more than just looking for, SQL injection or something like that. You guys are actually applying a lot of context to your awareness of the APIs behind you.
Absolutely true, and I think I want to make a strong point there. One of the first things that we had to do to become viable as a product, and this is talking 2004, was to do schema validation.
Oh,
that means
okay.
that we look at the whole message structure, and it's not just whether one field is too long, it's to whether the message structure conforms to one of the available messages allowed in this API. So back in the day, this was WSDL, right, and XML schema, and now it's JSON schema, and it's looking at the Swagger documents. It's also looking at things like we can go beyond what the Swagger says, and we can say, yes, I know the Swagger says you have an unlimited length field, but we're not going to allow a field longer than 15 characters anyway, for instance, and do things like the parsing attempts to attempt to fool the parser with escaped codes and LDAP injections and SQL injections and all those kinds of things. We can inspect those with fairly simple policy structures where they look at. So it gets very deep on how far you can inspect the message. You can also pull your pants down, as they say, and turn that stuff off. It's left very much as an operation, but we do have best practices guides on those kinds of things. And the default is pretty tightly controlled. But yeah, you can open it up for those public access things. But one of the things that then becomes necessary is things like rate limiting. But if you rate limit on a simple, WAF style thing, then what you get is a rate limit on accessing this API. You could, with the way that we've written the tools, limit an API key to a rate limit, or limit a single credential to a rate limit, or limit a certain API call to a rate limit, which means that the API call for get stock might be unlimited, but the buy stock might be limited to 10 requests a second.
Oh, interesting. So you guys get really granular in your rules and your and what's allowed and what's not. One of the things that I was reading today on Medium actually was an article where the author was describing different ways in which you can deploy an API gateway in a deployment, and I believe he presented three different options. One was where there was a central gateway and all the APIs were behind it, And he also proposed this sort of micro gateway structure where in the diagram he showed a different gateway in front of every single API. I don't know how that would scale, but there was this micro gateway structure, and then there was this idea of actually putting it in the container itself, and it was a container basically. What are your thoughts around deployment architecture and best practices and that sort of thing, as far as what layer 7 proposes in its deployment and what it supports?
In 2003, everybody did centralized ones.
Okay. So
That,
that's like the original deployment architecture was a central API gateway.
and one of the things that harkens back to is what you would do with load balancers back in the day. You had one F5, right?
Right,
With
right.
a cadre of technological priests that would bless the load balancer settings and things like that. And you had one Cisco in front of that, right?
Yeah.
But these days, especially with containerizations, there's load balancers built into every single step of your container deployments. So I think the same is true around API gateways. I believe very strongly in a somewhere between the super granular model and the larger model. I think departmental makes a bunch of sense. Why?
Oh, interesting.
Because when you look at the departmental model, you've got a group of APIs that are logically together, and you want a similar policy for them because generally your consumers are the same consumers of that departmental set of APIs. So there's no good reason to have that granularity. Now, there is a good reason to have the granularity if you're exposing them all, or if you've got some level of super distributed enterprise that doesn't trust each other, right? We've had 6 acquisitions in the last 3 months, and they don't know each other, so everything's going to have an API gateway in front of it. I think there's a model for all of those things. I think one of the things that you need to pay a lot of attention to is deployment maturity. Right. If you look at deployment maturity and you look at the ability to do granular deployments, apply a template to 16 APIs, for instance, right? Then you might consider the micro model. It just so happens that locating the gateway inside the piece, I put a patent on.
Oh, you're kidding.
I'm not.
Okay, so he wrote about something you patented. maybe
Yes.
it was your article I read. Are you on Medium? I can't remember the author's name.
Morrison and I are, yeah.
Or he totally plagiarized it for me.
Well,
I'm assuming now this is all Kubernetes stuff, I take it.
Well, yeah, but the Lambda model isn't all that different, right? There's a gateway in front of your useful service, right?
Right.
If you look at the model associated with just how a lot of even the old ESB type things worked, there was an ingress that did inspection, and then there was the back-end services. To me, the difference between that and a service mesh isn't all that much.
Right. Yeah, well, and it's interesting, because if you think about it, I'm sure that you could probably form an entire business. You'd probably start a company whose primary service is just one service, and that's helping companies architect their API rollout. I mean, it's insane. There's, I was reading an article the other day where they were talking about how the average number of APIs that a company runs now is 420. 420 APIs is the average number of roads. I'm sure you've seen more than that.
And when we started, people would have 10 SOAP APIs with 20 different entry points within each WSDL, which meant 100 APIs, really, because there's 200 different possible calls. Right. But that was in 2003. I've got a customer right now in the federal space that has 1,500 published APIs.
Oh my God. Well, now,
go ahead.
Are those all internet facing?
They're all facing their partners within government.
Oh, wow.
So it's not quite internet facing because I think they're on Nipronet, but
Well, so the architecture, the deployment of the placement for the API gateway then correct me if I'm wrong, is very much predicated on the number of APIs they have, because at some point, if you do it like you were saying, the patent that you have where it's like pretty much it's inside the container itself or part of the container itself, how would you scale that across 1500? I mean, you have 1500 API gateways.
Well,
I mean, at some point that doesn't scale, right?
you need deployability. Really, it has to come down to how good you are at handling that CI/CD,
Mm,
right? Because it becomes a question of how do you manage your artifacts and where are the artifacts managed, right?
right.
So going back to your idea there of having a single gateway in front of a single API. Now, to me, especially in the microservices world, what a microservice is to me is the basically personification, if you will, of a Scrum team. One Scrum team, one microservice. And if you say then therefore they also have a gateway, that means that you've got a security architect associated with that team, and that doesn't work that way. I'm real.
No, you're right. I mean, a company's lucky if they have more than one security engineer these days.
So the security architect needs to own that story, and that means that they need repeatability.
Right.
So the repeatability comes down to a CI/CD style thinking. And we're guilty in the past of having a very much centralized, as I said, the cadre of priests and the single external facing APIs. And there's a case for that. But I think the departmental model works, especially when your security architects need to know more about the API that you're exposing. And that actually brings me around to a point where, one of the discussions you and I've had over the last little while is talking about the different applications and their security vulnerabilities and how you have to know what it is that you're producing. And so when you want to look at those APIs, having somebody who's knowledgeable about the kind of APIs and the semantics of those APIs, I think the departmental model starts to make a lot of sense because there would be similarities in that department of what they're producing, what it's for.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the back in the day when you had, the before network threat, analysis solutions powered by ML. The days of pattern matching network intrusion detection systems like snort sensors that use databases of signatures. The recommended deployment structure for a network IDS was put it in front of like assets. So maybe you had a sensor in front of all of your database servers. Maybe you had a sensor in front of all your web servers, so you could tighten the rules down to just those that are applicable to those systems behind it. So if you know that all of your sensors behind all of your servers behind your sensor are Windows machines, it made no sense to have all of your Linux rules or Apache rules turned on. You could just leave your IIS rules or your Windows rules on. So it's correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of what you're saying here, right? Is the reason for putting the API gateway in front of specific departments is you can really tune that API gateway to those specific APIs.
I believe that to be very true. And I think because of how mobile apps are being developed, they're often being developed as assets of marketing teams. I think it's even more true. Mobile apps are considered part of your presence out there. And I think you really need to get that level of granularity so that you can separate, for instance, your data assets associated with your corporate line of business from perhaps a marketing driven capability that might be on one corner of your public mobile application, for instance. Now, mobile applications are a big driver of APIs, as we all know. And I think being able to have that level of granularity of control matters a lot. I think it's also important to note that the rule sets can be looser for certain things. And that's the other reason why a simple approach like a rule-based engine doesn't help you that much when you've got one API that is a single, a single field response with a single field, a single field request with a single field response. Should be treated differently than a 20 field request and a 20 field response. Like think about the difference between buying a stock and getting a quote. The parameter for getting a quote is a stock symbol, and the answer is just a currency and a number. Whereas buying a stock, you've got your credential, you've got your account, you've got the volumes, all this other kind of stuff. So it's a much more complex thing to look at that. And I think the granularity of rule sets also let you lock things down. You can have it so your business tool, and let's say you're a shipping company, ship from this location to that location, right? Well, that sounds simple until you consider, well, what if this is on behalf of some internet website? Now we've got three parties involved, right? What if it's coming from through the broker at the border between Canada and the US? Well, now you've got four parties, or maybe you have five because you got one on each side. So it starts to get a lot more complex. It starts to get a lot more needing of granularity, and the inspection of the content needs to be the same way, because there's no way to be really secure around this unless you know what content is passing through your infrastructure. The content itself bears some of the threats. These days, bluntly, with what's happening with GDPR in Europe and what's happening in California around personally identifiable information and things like that, you really need to know who's accessing what data. And that's kind of an area of where we're investing in. We're looking at permissions and authorizations around data and how that granularity affects people.
Interesting. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's a great segue. Why are APIs being breached? Why is it every day we wake up, there's a new API breach? And why APIsecurity.io always has content for their weekly newsletter of breaches? What's happening? What are companies doing wrong?
What are companies doing wrong? I don't think companies are doing anything wrong. I think that individuals at companies are treating the asset as the wrong kind of asset. You can look at a media asset of putting out yet another flyer or a video on YouTube as one thing, or you can look at it as betting your business with a brand new partner. Betting your business with a brand new partner is a scary operation, and network security architects and security architects are all over that kind of stuff. But if you've got the department who's used to putting out yet another bit of content on YouTube, right? Responsible for the asset that now has direct access to the business, you've got a conflict of interest, because the one who wants to get the content out there wants to remove every barrier.
Sure.
Whereas the one who wants to shut down everything also wants to prevent everyone from getting access, because, lowered attack surface equals less successful attacks, right? So you've got that tension between wanting to get the asset out there and wanting it to be secured. And that's why there's so many things, because basically there is a rush for the high ground of the eyeballs. And that's the reason why there's so many breaches. The rush to get the eyeballs doesn't pay attention to the let's lock this down thinking.
Are security, in your experience, are security engineers left out of the API deployment strategy and stakeholders with the project manager or the clients that you've been involved with, where it's just typically maybe the server ops, network ops, app dev?
I would say that when they're talking with us, we have better access. When they're talking in general, and the ones that you hear about on the news, those are the ones that went out without a good security inspection. The rather famous car compromise where all you needed was the vehicle identification number. That didn't involve a security architect at any point.
Right.
Whereas the kind of people we're talking to, and we're talking to auto vendors as well, the credentials that they're passing around are really quite strong credentials, and getting access to them is quite good. So I don't want to pick on, those guys, but when we're talking to security architects, they generally end up doing strong inspection of credentials, message layer, transport layer, all of those kinds of things. When we're talking to marketing department, they want to talk about reach, and they want to talk about analytics, and they want to talk about these other things. And it comes down to, what is your focus, right? If your focus is reach, well, that shouldn't have data assets. Not really.
Yeah.
Outbound only, as it were, right? Rather than those inbound queries.
Yeah. So layer 7 is definitely not an API management company. You guys are very much branding yourselves as an API security company with management capabilities. Is that
Right now,
accurate?
the way that we call it right now is full lifecycle API management. But for us, full lifecycle includes testing. BlazeMeter is one of our products,
Okay.
right? So one of the biggest SaaS available testing products, performance testing products as well. We have performance management tools, APM, the formerly known as Wiley tool, is part of our overall product portfolio. APM, which is a privileged access manager, which is a tool for managing privileged access to things like mainframe assets and big iron assets, also part of our security thing. So when we talk about full lifecycle, we're talking about creating the APIs. We have a live API creator product that lets you create APIs from scratch. We have tools for working with testing environments. We have continuous deployment tools in the continuous deployment director product line. We have tools associated with the continuous testing, so the application experience, and it's got a mobile capability that lets you inspect what the hotspots within your mobile app are. So very much full life cycle, all the way around from creating, envisioning. Like the Rally product is a Broadcom product as well. So that's requirements analysis, and we've got the deployment capabilities, we've got the API management capabilities, the API inspection, the mobile app inspection, the application performance management tools, the full life cycle. And it's not just from our group, it's across the thing. So when we talk about full lifecycle API management, we mean the strongest security we can. We mean hooking into the rest of the life cycle, right? So yes, we have a strong security focus, absolutely. I won't claim otherwise, but I will say that full lifecycle wise, it goes wider than just publishing an API.
It's from cradle to grave. So
We really
having a product from the initial developer firing up their ADE, writing their first line of code, to publishing the API when it's done. You guys are there every step of the way.
We do, and the fact that we have a mobile library that's a security-focused mobile library, focusing around orchestrating the OAuth sign-ins and then the credentialing of the mobile device, through inspecting that content when it comes to our device. It gets no special pass because it's our SDK. It's inspected like every other message. To getting it to the backend server and having that server under performance management, to network management, the Spectrum line of products known as UIM internally. That's part of our network security stack capability. So yeah, it's a pretty complete offering. But remember, CA Broadcom is a fairly large firm, and there's an awful lot of products and everything. As I said, we used to have something like 5,000 SKUs.
Sure.
Overall, yeah, it's a pretty big product line, and making them work tighter together is one of the biggest to-dos we have. CA was a more distributed, separate products thing, but Broadcom's much tighter on that.
Right. So who is the primary buyer that you guys sell to? Is it the CISO?
That's the thing. The CISO is the important new buyer for us, especially when you look at what kind of company that we appeal to. We own some of the largest set product lines in the mainframe security line, right? So mainframe security is still a thing, and the product line we have there is one of the biggest. And so the mainframe security has the CISO's ear, and the distributed products, which we're a part of, that's an important asset. In some ways, in some of the firms we're talking to, large banks, large insurance companies, they're moving from the mainframe world into distributed products, and all of them are looking at mobile. All of them are looking at APIs because that's what you do in 2019. Maybe in 1983 you built everything with a mainframe, but in 2019 everything's got an API.
It's all mobile first now. Yeah.
It's mobile first now. I was told by um, one of the chief digital strategists for a very large bank in New York that they expect by the end of 2020 that 40% of their traffic to their remote traffic to their bank was going to be from an app.
It's crazy. You probably saw that Akamai report. They just reported that 82% of their traffic that they're seeing as a CDN is now API traffic. It's crazy. Yeah, the 80%. That's just insane. It's a majority of the traffic now on the internet is not human to app traffic. It's
Yeah,
thing to thing.
the day of the website is going by the way of the dodo. In 2008, there were 900 million registered cell phones in India.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, 2008. Now, most of those were dumb phones, but it was changing. Now, just think of that. In Canada, the largest provider here has 6 million subscribers.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was just, I think a couple of weeks ago, I was reading this article. I think it was an article on Apple, but it was an article about how the number of laptop sales are going down and the number of mobile phone sales are going up along with tablets. Nobody wants to carry a heavy laptop anymore. Even though they're thin, the MacBook Air, and you've got these other, smart tablet computers like the Surface, but it's crazy. That's just too heavy for the average consumer. They want to just pull their phone out and log into their bank with their phone, do their wire transfer, do their bill pay, do their whatever, and put their computer back in their pocket. It's.
Thank you for giving me a great segue on that, because when you start to get to a mobile device, they're more easily stolen and the credentials to get in them aren't all that strong. So one of the things we're seeing emerging is threat around APIs. So seeing different patterns of behavior around API usage, different patterns of usage, and especially having ways to step up the authentication to the user so that you get this concept of, yes, it's my tablet, but it's not me because I'm using it differently, right? Or, I came in via the passcode rather than the thumbprint this time. So what does that tell me? Does it tell me it's the same user? I'm not sure. Now, I should step up the authentication, send multi-factor authentication. So risk management and API is an emerging area. We're working on that kind of thing. We want to hook that up to inspecting API traffic patterns. So if, for instance, someone's attempting to do a remote crack of you, they're not going to be calling the APIs in the same sequence that an app does. So
right.
Then look at what the sequence of usage in the app looks like and compare that to the real thing. So that's why this application experience tool and our own API inspection, coupled with threat management, give us a pretty strong defense in depth, because then the behavioral analysis starts to become very important.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask you what the next chapter is for layer 7.
Yeah.
Is it, so it is getting more into, you've got companies like Shape Security and some of these others that are now talking about use cases of being deployed in front of APIs to be able to separate out that human traffic from the bot traffic, or the human traffic from the automated traffic. So you guys are getting into that. You guys are very much looking at this from an authentication and authorization piece, saying, okay, this doesn't look like the same user. They're going in a different sequence of, they're operating in a different sequence. The packets are coming way too fast for a human, or, whatever it may be. So you guys are, this is the direction you guys are headed.
Yeah, so threat management in general is an important part of what we do. Threats in the past have been message-borne threats, like an individual message-bearing threats. But threats in the future are behavioral, they're contextual. Like, for instance, if what I normally do in a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue is check my account balance, most mornings around 9 o'clock, and suddenly from a IP address associated with Romania, I've got a transfer of $10,000. You'd say that that's probably not likely me, right? But we want to be able to make that so that even though we're analyzing those kind of threats, we can still make the user experience good. So we want to have it so that when that occurs and we ask for the step-up authentication, it doesn't suddenly become jarring. And, you know, especially in North America, they don't really want to turn down any credit card transaction. Whereas in Europe, they're a little different around that kind of stuff. They want to turn down everything they can because risk management profiles are different. But risk management and threat management is a very important future development. And in my humble opinion, I think that that's where we're going to see the biggest changes, because mimicking behavior, it's going to be an arms race, right? The bots will start acting like humans.
Agreed. Yeah, it's funny. I'm so glad you said that, because it's all about frictionless user authentication now. You know, frictionless solutions for the consumer, while also trying to balance security. And I think that's really, and looking at context, the fact that the attacks before were very much around just detecting patterns, detecting known knowns, right? And now it's really moving the way of, you're right, it's, we need to get smarter. It's all around behavioral anomaly detection. I think that's really what is making Sentinel-1 so successful, and why it's really just crushing the competition in EDRs, because they're understanding that context around security is paramount, and is, you know, context comes first. Otherwise, it's just noise.
Couldn't agree with you more. I'm interested to see what's going to happen. The GSMA Alliance in Europe has started a thing called Mobile Connect, and it's identity on the mobile device. And we haven't seen efforts like that in North America get any traction yet. I'm hearing some things from the telcos that make me think that there's going to be something coming soon. I've heard about an effort in Canada and one in the US. What
You're
I want,
saying where the mobile device will be uniquely tied to its owner somehow?
somehow.
Like through biometrics, or?
Well, we've got the FIDO pieces that start
Right, FIDO 2. Yeah.
to start to do that. But if the telco is also involved, there's a little bit stronger knowledge, because the location information that they have is stronger, right? Because they know the towers, right? They know which tower you're coming
Good
in.
point. Good
Yeah.
point.
The best location information in the world comes from the telcos, because they know which tower, they know all of those things, whereas that's not available to anyone. And
Right.
under the privacy rules in Europe especially, you can't reveal that, but they can participate in that conversation with the risk assessment. How strong do we have, how strong of location information do we have? And this can lead to some interesting places like off-track betting, for instance. You know?
Well, and it's funny because I'm sure you've heard this already, but the spectrum for 5G is so much shorter than 4G. Imagine how accurate the location, geolocation tracking will become now, where it's like, oh, that person is, you know, somewhere within the next 12 blocks. You know, for 5G, it's going to be like, oh, this person's on that block right there on the corner.
That would be one of the holy grails, but one of the things that's going to be interesting is it has to be a negotiation, because under GDPR, which is a big thing in our area, you have to be able to negotiate validating a location, not revealing a location.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the dynamic tension that we're under.
Serving multiple masters.
Well, yeah, because the user is now the master of their data.
Yeah.
That's another area coupled with risk that's going to be emerging. So the user is a master of their data. And if I was to look at the future, risk coupled with data ownership, right? So when I say, yes, you can use my Google identity to sign me into this website, the permissions management of who gets to see what data, when that's starting to go, it comes back to the consumer. And that's going to be one of the big areas, especially coupled with risk management, because for a company, they need to manage the risk of exposing a piece of data to a consumer that might not be who they say they are.
Good point. Yeah, we will close this out with my last statement before I ask you the last and final question, which will be a little bit more fun. Is my favorite quote from Anonymous, which is, if I was advising someone on how to take down the United States, I would tell them to target their APIs first. So it is pretty much what countries are running on now. Is
Absolutely
APIs.
True.
So
Okay.
it's good that you guys are. It's good that you guys are working for the good guys, and you're out there to protect us and our APIs. So how can CISOs and buyers out there find you and Layer 7? Where should they go to either maybe take a trial of your product or reach out to you and the company?
Layer space 7 API. That should find it. Just
Okay, cool.
Google
So it's just layer7.com then for the website.
I don't think layer7.com works, but Layer 7 API management should find us.
Oh, for Googling it. Okay, cool. Yeah. Oh, that's right.
Rather than putting some website out there.
I was just about to say it's Broadcom, isn't it? But so you guys are acting as a wholly owned subsidiary or something, but you guys are parked on a microsite for Broadcom, I take it?
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
I've been Layer 7 API management. You see an announcement, Layer 7 is now CA Technologies, and that was from the original purchase all those years ago. But there's the Layer 7 API gateway that shows up pretty quickly.
Okay, cool. So first page of results.
On the first page of results, yeah.
Cool.
You're looking for Broadcom, and you're looking for Layer 7.
So are you on Twitter? Can they find you on Twitter and LinkedIn?
They can find us on LinkedIn for sure.
Cool.
Can we find us on Twitter? I think we do have a couple of Twitter accounts, yeah.
Yeah, if not, we need to talk to Broadcom about @Broadcom Security or @Broadcom API. Well, Jay, it was a real pleasure having you on the show. I wish you a lot of luck. It sounds like you've got some new adventures ahead of you at Broadcom / Layer 7. And I actually am glad you guys went back to the old name. I like that name. I like Layer 7. That's a good name.
We got a round of applause here when it was announced, that's for sure.
I'm sure you did. Well, cool. I'm looking forward to working with you at Aite Group. We're going to be doing some research with you guys and partnering up and evangelizing the cool things happening over there. So I'm looking forward to it. You take care, and thanks for being on the show today. And good luck with the product and technology and taking over the world.
It was a lot of fun talking with you. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, Jay. Bye-bye.